So Israel wants a king. We're now in the book of First Samuel. Just finished up Ruth. Go back and watch the videos. The book of First Samuel, or 1 Samuel, as I've heard it in the past, begins with the question that still feels surprisingly relevant today. Who will lead us? For generations, Israel had lived under judges, some faithful, some flawed, some deeply compromised. The nation had experienced cycles of deliverance and decline. And by the end of Judges, the deeper problem had become painfully clear. Israel's greatest threat was not outside enemies, it was internal drift. So now the people began looking for a solution, a leader, a king, someone who can bring stability to the chaos. But First Samuel asks a deeper question. Can human leadership solve a spiritual problem? Because throughout this book, we'll watch Israel search for the right king, a king who looks strong, a king who appears capable, a king who seems able to fix what's broken. And again, God reveals something unexpected. The greatest need was never simply better leadership. The greatest need was transformed hearts. And that's where the story begins. Not with the throne, not with the palace, not even with the king, but with the grieving woman praying quietly in the temple. Before God raises a king, he listens to a woman. Her name is Hannah, and her story begins with heartbreak. For years, she longs for a child. Year after year, her prayers seem unanswered. Year after year, her pain grows heavier. Others misunderstand her. Some even mock her. But instead of walking away from God, Hannah brings her grief directly to him. One day, she enters the tabernacle and prays with such intensity that Eli the priest mistakes her silent prayer for drunkenness. Yet, what Eli misunderstands, God understands completely, because God often hears prayers that other people never notice. Eventually, God answers. Samuel is born, and Hannah does something remarkable. Instead of holding tightly to the blessing she received, she gives Samuel back to God. The very child she prayed for becomes the child she surrenders. And through Hannah, we learn an important lesson. God often begins his greatest work in hidden places. That's a constant theme throughout the Bible. Long before public leadership changes, God is already moving quietly in private. And the story of Hannah is a great story, how she was mocked even by her husband's other, I would say, wife. You know, they had a lot of stuff going on back in the day, but she remained faithful. While Israel drifts spiritually, a young boy is learning to listen. Samuel grows up serving in the tabernacle. So again, you have Hannah. She had a baby. She gave the baby up to God, returned him to the tabernacle, and we find ourselves here with the story of Samuel. Meanwhile, Eli's sons abuse their positions and dishonor God. Spiritual leadership is deteriorating, corruption is spreading, and then one night, God calls Samuel by name. At first, Samuel doesn't recognize the voice, but eventually he responds, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. You know, he kept going to Eli and said, Hey, did you call me? Eli said, No. And after, I think a couple of times, Eli said, The next time you hear their voice, he told him what to say. And here we have him saying, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. That moment becomes a turning point because while many around him have stopped listening, Samuel still does. And throughout his life, Samuel becomes exactly the kind of leader Israel desperately needs. Not because he is powerful, but because he listens. His life reminds us the problem is rarely that God has stopped speaking. Often, people have stopped listening. Eventually, Israel gets what they asked for, a king. His name is Saul, and at first, he seems perfect. He's tall, impressive, confident. Everything about him looks kingly. The people love him. Finally, Israel has a leader who looks like the king of the surrounding nations. But appearances can be deceptive because Saul's downfall doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, one compromise at a time, one act of partial obedience at a time. Again and again, Saul obeys God, but only partially. He follows God's instructions when they're convenient and modifies them when they're not. Eventually, Samuel confronts him with the sobering truth: to obey is better than sacrifice. Saul wanted the appearance of obedience. God wanted obedience itself. And this becomes Saul's tragedy. His greatest enemy was not the Philistines. It was the insecurity growing inside his own heart. Very interesting story when Samuel, the children of Israel, they reach out and God lets Samuel know. He said, "Hey, you're doing everything right," basically. I'm just paraphrasing it. If that's what they want, then that's what they're going to get. They haven't refused you, they've refused me. As Saul declines, God sends Samuel to Bethlehem. A new king has been chosen. When Samuel arrives, Jesse presents his sons. One by one, they pass before him. Strong, capable, impressive. Surely one of these must be God's choice. But God says, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Finally, David is called in from the fields, the youngest son, the overlooked son, the shepherd, and God chooses him, not because of his status, not because of his appearance, but because of his heart. And suddenly, the entire book pivots around one central truth: God evaluates differently than people do. I love this story of how David came into existence, becoming the king. And it's, of course, I would say, quote unquote, sad about what happened with Saul because he just kept partially obeying God. The story is very interesting. And again, as I've always said throughout these different books of the Bible, have an open heart and an open mind. I would say watch the videos, then go back and potentially read that book of the Bible, and it may make a little more sense, or expand your opening, your heart, your mind with watching the videos first and then going back and actually reading the version of the Bible that I don't want to say more comfortable to you, but that God has drawn you to. So it's very interesting. Then comes the story everyone knows: Goliath, a giant warrior who terrifies Israel. For 40 days, fear controls the nation. No one steps forward. No one acts. Everyone sees the giant. David sees something different. He sees a God bigger than the giant. What makes David unique isn't courage alone, it's perspective. While others measure the size of the obstacle, David measures the size of God. And the battle becomes about far more than a giant. It's about faith. Because fear had paralyzed an entire generation, but faith moved one shepherd forward. David said, "Who is this Philistine? Who is this person who should defy the armies of the Most High God?" I love that story. As David rises, Saul begins to unravel. Jealousy grows, fear grows, insecurity grows. The contrast between the two men becomes impossible to miss. Saul constantly grasps for control. David repeatedly trusts God's timing. Saul protects his position. David protects his character. Even when David has opportunities to kill Saul, he refuses because David understands something Saul never fully learned. You can win power and lose your soul, or preserve your integrity and trust God with the outcome, or preserve your integrity and trust God with the outcome. The difference between these two men is not talent, it's the condition of their hearts. You know, David came back from the battle, and the people started to say, "Hey, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands." And it was at that moment King Saul became jealous, and his his disposition just changed so much towards David that he set out to kill him. And so, even with that, David never did anything against Saul. David is anointed king, but he doesn't become king immediately. Years pass, years of waiting, years of uncertainty, years of running for his life. And this may be one of the most relatable parts of the entire book because many people know what it feels like to feel called, but not yet arrived, chosen, but still waiting, prepared, but not yet promoted. David learns that God's promises often involve a process, and character is usually formed in the waiting. By the end of First Samuel, Israel has learned something difficult. The right appearance isn't enough. The right title isn't enough. Even the right system isn't enough because leadership alone cannot fix a spiritual problem. Saul looked like the king Israel wanted. David looked more like the king God wanted. But even David will eventually reveal his own limitations. And that leaves us with a deeper question. What kind of king can truly heal what's broken? That question will drive the story forward into Second Samuel because the search for a king is not over yet. Thank you for being on this journey with First Samuel. We'll be moving on to Second Samuel. Go back, I would say, and watch the other videos and the shorts. And I will see you in Second Samuel.